Thank you all for being here today as we come together to honor our beloved Rebbe, Rabbi Akiva D. Mann of blessed memory, on the occasion of his first Yarzeit. Over the past year, I have found myself learning a new language, the language of thought, in mystical terms, the world of Machshava. It has been a journey of opening my heart and my mind to perceive the wisdoms and insights that Rabbi Akiva planted within me through the many years that I've been his student. And I know that I am not alone in this experience. Many of us have felt his presence, heard the whisper of his voice guiding us, and for this I'm deeply grateful. In his memory and honor, IJKL has had the privilege of organizing what I have been calling our Road Scholar Series. Over the past week, we have had the opportunity to bring Dr. Nir Boms to 7 different locations across Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties, and now to this virtual space. He has shared and will continue to share today his teachings, experiences, and insights in Middle East politics. This initiative began when our friend Dr. Zohar Raviv, who calls our Rebbe brother, reached out, and he told me about a dear friend of his who would be in South Florida, that he's an extraordinary teacher with valuable perspectives. Zohar believed that our community would deeply benefit from engaging with him, and we are delighted for this opportunity to learn together. Rabbi Akiva deeply valued in-depth learning and the discussion of meaningful ideas. When we realized we could create this program, it became clear that it would be truly a fitting tribute to his legacy, an opportunity to honor him in the way he cherished most. I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to Rabbi Mark Goldman for his brilliance in making programming happening, to Dr. Sandra Lilienthal for organizing programs and hosting Nia for Shabbat, and to our programming partners, the Jewish Federation of Broward County, B'nai Torah Congregation, Kol Tikva, Temple Sinai North Dade, and Temple Kolami Emmanuel. And now a special thanks and deep appreciation for the love and for Rabbi David Ingber for being part of leading Romamu South. Take it away, Rabbi David.
Thanks you. And so I just want to make sure, Akiva David Yitzchak?
Mm-hmm.
Akiva David Yitzchak Ben?
Menashe the Adel.
Akiva Yitzchak David.
Say that again, El.
Akiva Yitzchak David, okay. Thank you.
And Rav Menashe Dov.
So I think that, so we miss you, Akiva. And I miss you as a brother. I miss your sweet, tremulous voice, the way that you would, when you'd speak to me and say, David, could hear you saying it to me now. I miss your voice and the way that we would have honest conversations about the life of the rabbinate and the life of yearning for Hashem. And it's, I think, one of the things that we often spoke about was like just, a yearning for God and a sense of absence and presence, and being able to be honest about, nafshi chashka, that my soul wants you, Hashem, and I look for you, and sometimes I can't find you, but even when I'm in Sheol, I'm even in the darkest places, sometimes able to see a little bit of light there and find you there. Asah Shamayim, when I go to the heavens, you're there. When I go down to the bottom, you're there. And Akiva was like that. He knew how to travel in those different spaces. And I just want to also thank Ellie, I want to thank you and your family, especially when I came down. I remember some of the stories you told about being a child of Akiva and having an Abba like Akiva. I still think about those stories of how he would play with you on Shabbat afternoon. And, Akiva's presence, like Moshe's presence in this week's Torah portion, Moshe's not present any longer in name, but he's everywhere. And I feel your father also is very much a present of all those people who are here this morning. So Elam alei rachamim Shavavochein ba'mirumim Hametzei Menucha nechona Tachas Kanefei hashchina B'ma'alos B'ma'alos kedoshim utorim Kizohar harakia mazirim Es nishmas Morenu Rabbeinu Avinu Yedidenu Rabbi Akiva Yitzchak David ben Rav Menashe ve'Edel Menashe Dov ve'Edel Shahalach le'olamo Began Eden Began Eden Began Eden Emin Chaso Lachein bara rachamim yastirehu V'seiseh k'nafav le'olamim V'yitzro b'tzorah chayim Es nishmaso Adonai havayahu nachalaso V'sanuach v'shalom Al mishkavo V'nomar Amen.
Let's just hold that for a minute. Thank you. I'm going to invite Rabbi Mark Goldman to introduce our speaker. Thank you, Duffy. Thank
Love
you.
you all. I have to go. I'm sorry, but
We'll see you around the block.
amen.
Thank you for that, Rabbi David. Thank you, Kim. Welcome, everybody. Firstly, I would like to thank all of you for being here and say how important it is to support IJKL. It's only through your support and your membership that we are able to bring incredible speakers like the one we're just about to hear, as well as our weekly programming. So thank you. And speaking of weekly programming, we have one edition, which you'll be seeing on the connections, and also an email from me very, very shortly, which is next Friday, March 14th, which is, of course, Purim. At 10 o'clock in the morning, we will be having a special Megillah reading and study and discussion with myself and Rabbi Uri Romano, the senior rabbi of Temple Kolam Emmanuel. And if any of you would like to participate by reading a chapter of the Megillah in English or in Hebrew, if your Hebrew is good, then please shoot me an email. We would love for that as well. It's going to be in person and also in Zoom as well next Friday at 10 a.m. But without further ado, let me say a couple of words about our brilliant speaker this morning, the expert's expert on the Middle East. Dr. Nir Boms is a research fellow at Moshe Dayan Center in Tel Aviv. He's the author of The Syrian War 2020 and Regional Cooperation in the Midst of Regional Conflagration 2025, co-founder of cyberdissidence.org and the Tziol Ryler Project, and a former VP Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. He has a claim to fame, which is not widely known, or you won't find on his official bio, and that is he got stuck in a Syrian rebel military camp in the middle of the Syrian war. and maybe he will say a few words about that. But we're awfully happy that you managed to get out of that military camp. And thank you for joining us today. And we're all very excited to hear from you, Dr. Nir Boms.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rabbi Mark, Rabbi David before, my dear Kim. It's a pleasure to be here. And after the short presentation just a few minutes ago, I feel that I am really standing on the shoulders of giants, and I'm happy that I'm able to take a part in this. This is my last sort of presentation in this week that was so graciously organized by IJKL and by Kim. I'm first of all very thankful for the hospitality and for the acceptance and for the dialogue and for the engagement. My coming to the States was really not for this. I came to deal with some issues that actually has to do with the title of the lecture, and I was asked here to speak a little bit about some of the prospects for the future in Gaza, and I'll get to it in a second. I came back with some meetings in Washington. I continue the role of some players here in the administration and outside the administration is important. But I was really privileged to have a chance to stop for a few days and have some very meaningful conversations and exchange. And I hope and believe that this is only a beginning. You will allow me, I will try to share a screen here. And I hope just let me know if this is, I think it is working. And with your permission, I was asked to do something about the Gaza's path forward, looking at the opportunities, and I will start a little bit with Gaza and end with Gaza as well. And in the middle, I will try to put some context on some of the broader configurations and some of what is going on in the Middle East. And of course, we'll stop for a dialogue and exchange, which is always the best part of all of this. Of course, we cannot start speaking about Gaza without speaking about October 7th. In October 7th, like many Israelis, I found myself utterly surprised in the middle of a holiday. But for me, it was also a bit more personal because at the end of that week, I found myself in the Gaza division. I'm a major in the IDF. And I got a call from my commander to join the Gaza division. This is the base that was attacked and for a brief while was actually occupied by Hamas. The base was ransacked, but this was the base that is responsible for the preparation for what soon will be the Gaza land maneuver, but also the base that is responsible for the Gaza corridor. All the communities that you've heard so much about, Be'eri, Kfar Aza, Nir Oz, we were the team that was responsible that taken that territory on the week of October 7th. There were still battles waging there. And some of the pictures that I'll share with you are my pictures, from there. And our job there was actually, after cleaning and dealing with this, was to make sure that from day one, we're beginning to work on how to bring our people back home and how to get the land working again and how to begin to rebuild. This was a very interesting and a very different instinct, I think, than just about everywhere else. We were tasked of thinking about how do we rebuild really from day one, knowing that every war will have an end and knowing that we will need to bring our people home. And it's, for a group like this, I know from very involved members of the Jewish community, I don't know what each and any of you had done, but I know from the get-go that I owe you, as an Israeli and as an officer in the IDF, I owe you some thanks, because I have seen the help and the amazing support that came from Jewish communities abroad. I have felt it in so many ways. With so much in the way of volunteering, in bringing equipment, in people who came and just said, we're going to cook, we're going to paint a house. People were extremely mobilized. And this is one of the things that made this very, very difficult period it helped our resolve and it made it possible to cope. there's a lot of stories from Gaza and from October 7th. This is one of the pictures that was found in Gaza really in the first weeks of the war, and it tells, perhaps in one picture, it tells us one part of the very tragic story. I mean, you would see all the pictures that you probably know of all those young children with guns and AK-47. But in the middle of this picture, what you see is a permit, a job permit, a work permit. These were the permits that were used for the workers from Gaza who went to the communities and afterwards brought, unfortunately, some of the information of where the different people live and brought inside. There is one story that for me connects a lot of my work, which has to do with the Middle East and engagement and also working with Palestinian voices from Gaza, that's perhaps mentioned through as we speak about Gaza. Some of you may know the name Vivian Silver. Vivian Silver is a peace activist. She created an organization called Women Wage Peace. And I had the pleasure of hosting Vivian Silver in my home not so long before October 7th. The occasion was a Shabbat dinner I hosted with a very interesting guest from Gaza, a woman by the name of Manar el-Sharif. Manar el-Sharif is born in a very prominent Palestinian family. Her father was the chief of staff of Musa Abu Marzouk, number 3 in Hamas, one of the most important people today in the Hamas organization. And when she came of age, of course, she's sent to the best university in Gaza, and she's studying there, but she's a bit of a rebellious personality. And she's saying, well, look, we're stuck here. We are under curfew and siege, and I want to understand what's going on. And she said, I want to contact the other side. Who are my neighbors? And she's trying to get to know them, and they're creating Zoom conversations. And Vivian Silver is working together for a few months until Hamas finds out. They stop this. They penetrate to one of the Zooms. They find her. They jail her. They literally put her in prison for a few months until, after some intervention, she's able to go free. She goes to Egypt. She escapes to the UAE, and from there we find her again. And she has a dream to come to Israel and to meet some of the people that she met virtually. It's a long story how we got her there, but we did. And then we have this very special evening where Manar and people from Be'eri, including Vivian Silver, are all in my house speaking about how potentially we can build a different future in a day after Hamas. I found myself on uniform telling that story next to the home of Vivian Silver in Be'eri, next to the burned home of Vivian Silver, after Vivian Silver as well was one of the symbols of the communities in the South who wanted a different future, and how October 7th have burned not just her, but so much hope. But I'm starting with this because what I want to share with you actually is a story that has to do with a bit more hope, not less hope. But it's important perhaps to start low so we can perhaps go a little higher. These are some of the pictures. What you see here is me down deep in a Gaza tunnel of one of the Gaza tunnels of Hamas. You see here near Oz, and you see here the dining room of Be'eri that turned into a military camp. This is the Nova Festival. But from here, what we have done is, after beginning to clean all of this up, is we have begun to build and began to get the land going. We were working on one of the largest volunteer operations in the history of Israel, where many people from the diaspora also came, just to make sure that the fields are grown, that the cows are being taken care of. And it took us a few months to begin to bring the people home. Not all of them returned, but I was very proud that, again, from very day one, we were thinking about rebuilding. And in that spirit, I want to speak a little bit about what is happening here in the Middle East and how potentially we can rebuild a different future. when it comes to Gaza, or when it comes to the Middle East at large. Of course, the title was Gaza and October 7, and that's also usually means that we speak about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the majority of Jewish groups. That is the case. I was sharing that I did an exercise once with my students, and I asked them to bring me the most popular books they found on the Middle East conflict. And 9 out of 10 books were, of course, about what? The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as there are no other conflicts in the Middle East. But the picture is really not entirely true. There are 2 circles of conflict. And the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is conflict that we are very much stuck with. And after October 7, there's unfortunately more to say about it. But there is a broader scene here. And if you're looking this a little bit from a historical perspective, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a smaller part of a larger Israeli-Arab conflict. And that's a conflict that overall has been beginning to be more resolved than not. The number of Arab countries with whom Israel has engaged and now signed peace agreements, starting with Egypt and Jordan, then the Palestinians, and then Morocco, Bahrain, UAE, Sudan with the Abraham Accords, but many more countries with whom we have actual relationships. I was sharing some stories about how this looks like. When you go to the shipyard of a door factory in Ashkelon, and you see stocks going, so this one goes to the UK, this one goes to Europe, and this one without any words in Hebrew, well, that goes to Saudi Arabia. We have created these types of collaborations behind the scenes, and some of the pictures here, depict some things that came out in the public. But as somebody who's actually been involved in some of these meetings, I can tell you that there is much more than meets the eye. If we're looking at October 7 in particular and compare it to one of the other wars, and I will come back to in a few minutes, of independence of 1948, when we also were fighting 6 different fronts, and now we were fighting 7 different fronts, also Yemen, along with Syria and Lebanon and Gaza and the West Bank, as well as Iraq and Iran. There is one startling difference. We did not fight any Arab country in this round. Even more so, no Arab country take an ambassador away. We were fighting only one country and proxy force of the same country, and that country is Iran. The people we were fighting in Lebanon were emissaries of Iran. The same in Syria, the same in Iraq. The Israeli-Arab conflict is in a very different place. And to remind you, there are 15 million Palestinians, there are 450 million Arabs, there are 1.7 billion Muslims, and that gives you a bit of a perspective, a little bit of where we are. The Middle East has seen a lot of turmoil in the last 15 years. This is the pictures from the last Arab summit in 2010. And some of the names here, the faces here may be familiar to you. It's Ben Ali of Tunisia, it's Ali Abdullah Saleh of Yemen, it's Gaddafi of Libya, it's Hosni Mubarak of Egypt. For those of you who have been following the Middle East for a while, of course, these were familiar faces. They were the only faces, actually. I remember that when Egypt, Mubarak was deposed in the beginning of the Arab Spring, Israel was in panic. Nobody knows anyone in Egypt except Mubarak and 5 other people around him. There are no civic society connections. The last student that was in Israel from Egypt was in 1982. We don't know anyone there. And all of a sudden, we are facing a whole new reality. But why is the Middle East was at war? And why all these people who were controlling in the Middle East for 4 and 5 decades were all gone in just a few years? So just to give a little bit of context, this chart, which I think is one of the most interesting ones that can give you a glimpse of this. You see the countries here in the Middle East, and there are really 2 numbers. The top number deals with the percentage of population under the age of 25. And I want you to look for a second at some of these countries. Over 50% of Egyptians are under 25, almost 60% of Sudanese, 55% of Jordanians, 60% of Iraqis, 55% of Syrians. These are the numbers that goes from the beginning of the Arab Spring, 2010. The populations now are already much higher. The lower number is GDP. And I want you in your mind to juxtapose these two numbers. 60% under the age of 25 with a GDP of $2,300 a year in Sudan, or a little more in Jordan, or less than $5,000 in Syria. The reality of this is very simple. 70% of the Middle East is under the age of 30. Young people who understand that the systems that surrounds them cannot bring them prosperity, cannot bring them options, cannot bring them future. Some of that has to do with this agenda of constant war and struggle. And remember that these revolutions in the 60s and in the 70s, they made a promise. When the Ba'athist regime comes to power, they promise prosperity, they promise redemption, they promise to win the enemies and occupy Israel. They don't deliver. And 30, 40, 50 years later, all these young people find themselves in a scenario when they already are connected to the world, to the internet, and they understand that life can be different. And what do they want? They want a change. And this is really what they're trying to do. Sometimes people ask, because we are used to see the Middle East through the prism of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the most important thing. It's the condition of everything else. But when you ask the people, and this is a public survey from the middle of this period, from 2017, what's important to you? What scares you? So the biggest obstacles facing the Middle East is not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This comes, as you see, number 6 and number 7 in most of these polls. Much before it comes issues like terrorism, because at the time when the Islamic State was there, these young Arabs literally fear, because it can come to their home. They can also find themselves in the middle of a war, and they don't want it if they're not a part of it. So they're afraid of terrorism, of radicalization. And that brings to what also? Of course, to unemployment, to civic unrest, to rising cost of living, to economy. And they want leadership that will deal with that, because they want to live, and they want to live a life that can be lived, and they want to fulfill their dreams. After they're thinking of all of that, perhaps they have a little bit of time to speak about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It's not and never been the most important issue on their agenda. Although, of course, in the media and everywhere else, it always gets a bit higher than its weight. So we are seeing a period of about 15 years of turmoil and war. The Syria war has been the longest, but of course, Lebanon has not been stable. Iraq has not been stable. Syria, we just discussed. And we've also seen some changes in the powers to be with all this period. The US broadly is decreasing its influence in the Middle East. This is, just to remind you, this is Iraq and this is Afghanistan. And this is the perception that the US is not very strong when it comes to Iran. And the issue of Iran is the issue that really bothers many of the partners in the Middle East. These dictators, as we just discussed, the ones who were there for 40 years, they're all out. The Saudis are also not a significant influence. They are also going through transition. A new king who is we'll hear more about him, Mohammed bin Salman, is coming of age, but it takes him some time to assert influence. And on the other hand, the Americans are out, but the Russians are further in. And the Turks are becoming much stronger. The Iranians, that's the first flag, are obviously coming in. We hear much more about them. And in the context of October 7, it's become very clear. And the last one are the Islamists. So the Iranians are radicals coming from the Shia side of the Muslim map. The Islamists are radicals coming from the Sunni side of the Muslim map. Groups like Hamas are part of the Muslim Brotherhood, are Islamists that are Sunni. Groups like Hezbollah are Islamists that are Shia. Overall, they don't usually meet each other or connect with each other, but if they have a common enemy like Israel, sometimes it works. And in Syria, we forget, because the Syrians, the Alawites, who are offshoot of the Shias, they were very good in trying to host all of these groups, because they're a little bit not here and not there. So they're the Muslims of the UN, so they can create the United Nations Council of Terrorist Organization and can host everyone in Syria. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Sunnis, the Shia, they all had offices in Damascus. And this is how we are progressing toward the period that certainly for us is also about the current war on October 7th. If you're looking at all of this, and this is much before October 7th, again, to remind you, we're seeing here an axis of threats. So Yemen in the south, terrorists in Sinai, Hamas in Gaza, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the mothership of Hamas that continues to radicalize Muslims around the world. We have groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, ISIS, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and really from almost every side, we are able to see threats that are coming to us from countries like Iran that leads it, what is happening in Syria, Jordan that may not be stable, and terrorism in the West Bank. But on the other hand, there's another way to look at this. We sometimes think that Israel is isolated against all of these threats, but that's not entirely true. There is a block of countries that seems to be concerned about the exact same thing. The Egyptians, for them, it's Hamas is a terrorist organization. The Muslim Brotherhood are a terrorist organization. These are the people who had murdered Sadat. These are the people who took power in 2012, and the Egyptian military actually took them off power. These are the people who can create a revolution in countries like Jordan and in countries like Egypt, and therefore they are actually terrorist organizations, and they're fighting them. The Saudis, the Emiratis have even a tougher approach than that of Israel when it comes to this. They are afraid both of the Sunni radicals, because they're Sunni, and if they will radicalize the country, they can come to them. And they are afraid from the Shia radicals, from Iran, because of the Iranian agenda, and because Iran had already shown that it can send missiles and attack the oil reservoirs also, both in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE through its proxies. So when we're looking at this, these threats that I discussed, the threats that comes from Iran, that comes from Qatar, Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Hezbollah, the groups of the destabilizers, as well as all these terrorist groups. So again, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Salafi jihadists, all of them are the Sunni radicals. Iran, Hezbollah, these are the Shia proxies, but they're all pose two parts of the same threat. And they're threat not only us, they're threatening a number of other countries on the stabilizing bloc. And if you're looking at why the Abraham Accords were created, now you can begin to understand the logic here. There are some common threats, there are some shared interests, and some common work can be done together. So when we speak about the Abraham Accords, and when we speak about Gaza, this is one of the main agendas of Hamas on October 7th, to make sure that this agenda that I'm just speaking about is going to be cut. It's making sure that the Palestinian agenda will be back on the top of the list and not on the bottom of the list. But when we speak about the dynamic of the Abraham Accord, is exactly about these threats. And particularly, it's about the security dimension. So you see here pictures from the Red Sea, one of the Yemeni attacks on a ship carrying oil. Egypt, by the way, was the country that lost the most, because now ships are afraid to come in. Suez, which is the most significant income source for revenue for Egypt, is no longer able to get so many ships. So Egypt is in deep trouble, but also the Gulf and the Emirates, because they are dependent on this. Their trade and security as the most important issues that they have, as well as, of course, the free routes for oil. And they need the collaboration for this. And there's not so many countries who are actually able to tackle this. They were trying to do this for a few years and were not able to do it. And we'll see how this particular issue becomes more important. Of course, it's not the only leg. There were official visits. There was business and business cooperation. And I mentioned to you already that there were over 500 collaborations on business when it came to 500 Israeli companies. And there was one perhaps interesting story to share about that. Some of you may remember a piece of news from 2010 when, according to foreign sources, of course, as we always say, Mossad team came to Dubai to deal with a certain Hamas member, Mahmoud al-Mabhouh. He was a weapons dealer, and the Mossad team was sent all the way to Dubai to take him down in a hotel. And why do we know about this? And I'm not sure if this story is familiar to you, but feel free to Google it later. We know about this because a few hours later, the Dubai police was actually able to take pictures, to show pictures and find the passports of all of these Mossad members who came dressed as tennis players to a tennis tournament. And everybody were very surprised. How did they do it? They had face recognition technology. In 2010, they were able to expose a Mossad operation, not very good for Mossad. What's the piece that was not very well known? Who installed that technology? Israel. And why Israel installed that technology? Because they wanted to help the Emiratis to deal with terrorists who may come to hurt them, not to expose Mossad. This was such a secret operation that I guess even the Mossad was not in the loop. A bit of a fault, but another interesting example of this collaboration. There are Jewish communities in these countries. They're not big and they're not old, although in Bahrain, actually, the Jewish community is a little older. These are new Jewish communities, mainly business community. But you have Jews who have connections to Israel and otherwise, and they are able to also play a certain role in creating connections. And in 2018, the Jewish community was allowed, that's 2 years before the Abraham Accords, to be visible, not hiding, as a part of the year of tolerance. And then, of course, civic society. And we have seen all those beautiful, beautiful pictures. And I just want to try to remind you of one of them. If the computer here will let me do this.
On behalf of Ben Gurion Airport and all, we are delighted to welcome you on this first commercial flight to Israel. It is the dawn of a new era of peace and prosperity for our countries and hopefully for the entire region. Marhaba, welcome to Israel.
We are happy to be here. We are so excited. This is the beginning of a good relationship between UAE and Israel.
So, what is happening in the same decade and a half of war is that slowly, the Palestinian issue is being pushed just a little bit. What you see here in this chart from 2011 is you see that although the Palestinian issue is still a cause, it's a cause for all Arabs, not just for the Palestinian people, but you see a bit more people beginning to think, you know what, perhaps we should leave it to the Palestinians. Perhaps it's not our issue. The Palestinians are criticized by many of the Arab partners, certainly in the Gulf, because their leadership is corrupt, because they're not making any concessions, they're not trying to bring any positive vision. And some of the Arabs saying, like, guys, just leave them alone. We cannot really be the guardians of the Palestinians all the time. And we actually need to move on. We cannot wait for the Palestinians to, we need to move on. And that's, again, a part of the Abraham Accords. And now you see what's happening in the Gaza war, again, October 7. Already you're erasing our achievement. The Palestinian issue is back, particularly on the public opinion. Although I will try to argue to you that is not entirely true. Hezbollah joins the war on October 8. And this war that begins in Gaza soon enough becomes a larger war, and Iran is able to implement the strategy that was built by the legendary Qassam Soleimani, the commander of the Al-Quds force, and all the proxies of Iran are beginning to fight. And I want to tell you again something on let's connect to the first slide that I shared with you. And I told you that this war is comparable really only to the war of 1948. If you look at this chart and the wars that we have endured, most of them were very short wars. 1967, of course, that was the 6 Days War. That's why it has its name. 1956, the Suez operation was 8 days. Yom Kippur, 19 days. The Lebanon War was longer, it's 3 months. And we've had some longer wars. That's 1987, that's the Intifada. 1991 is the Iraq War, and then the second Intifada. But these are not intense wars. This is a period in where we sum up a less intense war. Only the war of 1948, 19 months, 6,400 dead, can begin to be compared to what is happening now, 17 months of war following October 7th. But as I said, one of the big differences, if you're looking at this, in 1948 we fought 6 Arab countries, in 5 different. In 1956 it was a war in Egypt. In 1967 it was Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. But afterwards, it's in the Intifada fighting the Palestinians. And when we're looking now at this war with multiple fronts, I repeat again, we're not fighting the Arabs. We're fighting Iranian proxies. We're fighting only a non-Arab country. And the Arabs are actually, as we will see in a second, are actually helping us. And that this comparison, I think, is useful. And now you see the different fronts that we're fighting in 2024 and the fronts that you see in 1948. Similar fronts to some degree. Over there we had the, Iraq and Saudi forces that have, came to help. Of course, Syrian forces, Lebanese forces. Today, you see some of these forces, but they're not sent by the countries. They're sent by proxies of Iran. And the countries are actually, in some ways, are fighting in our side. When we send the pilots to bomb in Iran and to neutralize the missiles, we made sure that they will see some of these pictures, that we even send women women pilot to kill them, because this is something that they don't always like. But what it also showed that what Israel did in all of these fronts, and that is able to destabilize and to decapitate the Iranian proxies, that this particular move is actually opening very interesting prospects for the future. So let's speak a bit about this regional arena, and as I showed you in this chart before, that all of a sudden the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is coming back to the top of the agenda. Are we still able to retain this Abraham Accord spirit? And I want to argue to you that actually we've stood a very important test, and that this particular war actually may even strengthen, and that's maybe counterintuitive, the relationship that we have. So to begin with, diplomatic relations. Usually when we, of course, diplomats are coming back home, we have protests. That did not happen. The Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Emiratis, Bahrain, they're all stayed. The embassies are working. They're working more quietly, but they're working. They're even having and holding meeting, and more than one on the future. Why? Because the mediators, as you know, are also a part of the Abraham Accord countries and other countries in the Gulf. They are very involved. They cannot abandon this. The security dimension, as we mentioned before, of course, is extremely important. It's became even more important, and the IDF, the chief of staff of the IDF and all the other chief of staff and security core teams from all of these countries that had more than one meeting together, again, discussing all of this. Iran is a common threat. The Red Sea is a common threat. They're all a part of the coalition led by the US to restore stability for the Red Sea. And they're all afraid from the Houthis in Yemen, and the only country that actually is able to bomb it is Israel. More reasons to speak. Energy and business, the data from 2024, despite the war, was actually an increase, not a decrease in the financial activity. Civic society is perhaps one of the categories that we have seen less of, obvious reason. Public opinion is not for us, but I can tell you that I had the pleasure to actually host a number of guests and official guests from the Gulf at the time of the war. And I've taken them down. I remember a particular visit of a very important official that did this incognito, of course, is not supposed to be posted anywhere. And we took him to the south, and I got him to meet hostage family, in a Bedouin hostage family. The whole discussion was in Arabic. He was amazed by this, and he told me all the time, listen, I cannot believe this. We don't hear any of this. I'm going to bring it to the king next week. That's exactly what he did. These relationships continued. The Palestinian issue actually became another cornerstone in all of this discussion, because they feel responsible to some degree for the Palestinians. They're mediating the Palestinians. They are taking responsibility for some of the day after. We're now hearing this Arab plans for Gaza. I'll discuss this in just a few minutes as I'll end toward the end of this presentation. And therefore you have something else to discuss. And of course, the Americans, the cooperation we have with the US, the cooperation the Gulf has with the US, the involvement of the US, and now even under this administration, where President Trump is pushing the Arabs with his plan to create an alternative plan, means that we have much more to speak about. And with this, I argue to you that despite the war and despite the issues of public opinion, the collaboration is actually increasing. And we actually speak now with people that we did not speak before, also in countries like Syria and Lebanon, of course, Saudi Arabia. I can tell you that I hosted a good number of Saudis in Israel already. I have the hobby of hosting interesting people for Shabbat. And one of the lines I've used that from 1948 until the beginning of spring and the war in Syria, you can count on one hand the number of Syrians ever to have been in Israel, and I can count on many more hands the number of Syrians who have been to my Shabbat table since. And so if we're looking at post-war, we are seeing a bit of a different picture than the picture that I've shown you before. Who is in and who is out. So the dictators are still out. But now the Islamists and the Iranians are beginning to be out. And they're out not because they want to be out. They're out because we have decapitated them, because we have bombed their leadership, because we have taken their bases, because we went and bombed all the way in Iran. Russia, that was one of the main reasons why Assad won the Syrian war. Russia is busy. It does not have all the time in the world to deal with the Middle East when it deals with Ukraine. And on the other hand, the US is back, is becoming more involved in the Middle East. You see two other countries there. The red-white flag is the flag of Qatar. We hear much more on UAE, and the next one to it, the green one, is Saudi Arabia, and above it, Turkey. So these are the countries that are now in the front and the center. And you remember that even in the time of the war, we're having and continuing to have, this is the Biden administration that has been working very hard, both to support Israel as well as to bring this normalization deal into progress. Was not able to bring it to a close, but this is happening in the time, in the middle of the war. We are having this discussion, and we're having these discussions again because these countries are concerned about the same thing, and they're actually helping us. The 5th year to the Abraham Accords last September, the Saudi ambassador attends a conference with Israelis. Something that we would not think would happen. Again, it's a sign of progress for normalization in the middle of the war. And I promise you that I will sum up by coming back to Gaza and looking at the ramifications of all of this on what are the possible prospects for Gaza in the future. So, of course, these are difficult times. There are still 59 hostages in Gaza. We very much would like and hope to get them back. I'm sure that all of you had seen the very dramatic moments yesterday following the meeting of Trump with the families and this tweet and etc. And I will get back to that in just a couple of minutes. Of course, we were all mourning and shocked by the Bibas family and the level of cruelty that we have seen and we've endured, and in every release of hostages, this ritual ceremonies, but we still would need to get the hostages out, and we still need to get Hamas out, and the two of them do not always work together. But that's not the only front. This is a piece about Syria, and I brought it here to just touch on that front, because in Syria there's also been a major change, and I can deal perhaps with that in the more in the Q&A, but I will just say one line. This picture that you see here is a picture from the Operation of Good Neighbors 10 years ago, in where we were able to help over 1.5 million Syrians in a humanitarian operation that existed between 2013 and 2018. This is supply line from the Hermon mountain on donkeys for one of the besieged villages that was made from Israel. We have developed relations with Syria, and we have potential chance to engage with Syria and reset the relationships that we have with Syrians in the future. We have perhaps a similar chance in Lebanon, and this chance is done because we had prevailed in Gaza, and we prevailed in the war in Lebanon. And you see how these fronts are related. This is a Syrian fighter in a long video says why we hate Hezbollah, why we as Syrians hate Hezbollah, why we want Israel to win. This is a message in Hebrew from September, and I'll translate it. Thank you very much, Netanyahu, for killing Nasrallah. You have shed a light on the way of peace. We are congratulating you. Syrian revolt, 28 September 2024. Iran, of course, remains the most difficult challenge here. 2025 will be the year in where probably something will happen. If it's not going to be an agreement, it may be a military action, and I'm happy to relate to that also in the questions and answer. And when I bring us to a close, I want to create just a summary on the Gaza front and the October 7 war. So to begin with, of course, there was a failure. We are looking at a prolonged war with no end in sight, following the worst massacre since the Holocaust. Hamas and Hezbollah were decapitated, they were damaged, but somehow they're still standing. This problem is not gone. This is the first war in where Israel lost territory. Close to 150 Israelis were evacuated. There are still tens of thousands that are still unable to go back home. It's a war that divided the country. And of course, you have seen this as well. Israel is under attack in the arena. This had touched many Jewish communities because of anti-Semitism. And the Palestinian issue that a little bit cornered with the Abraham Accord is back on the table. And we don't know yet what will be the day after. But it's important to have another perspective on this. October 7 was a 1973 moment. It was a moment when we were surprised. It's a moment when we were under attack. It's a moment in where we felt that our military not only was not ready, it's also not able to finish the war. Our country had mobilized, but we felt that this is a tragedy that also happened 50 years and one day after 1973. But a few months later, and certainly in September, if you remember the story of the beepers of Hezbollah, and then the 2 missile attacks that were thwarted, and then the fact that we found the leadership of both Hezbollah and Hamas with Mohammed Isa, Ismail Haniyeh, and then Nasrallah, we to get a little bit more oomph into our cheeks because we begin to feel that this is back into a little bit of a 1967 moment. We were able to get at least some of the hostages home. We were able to finally prevail and win. The missile attacks that had happened in April and October showed that we were able to stand the most sophisticated missile attack that ever was launched against another country. And not only we did that with 0 casualties, we were also able to get the Arabs countries coming to fight with us and not against us on this. And then we were able to tackle and attack Iran and hit the defense systems, perhaps showing the capabilities that may be used in if and where we will. Defense system has proved itself, and the Israeli society, I think, has proved itself. The US has stood in the side of Israel. President Biden, really, despite some arguments that he had, Netanyahu, or perhaps Netanyahu had with him, we had the support and the $14 billion, and really, it's all these alliances stood very, very still. And therefore, it cannot be a complete failure, although if we're looking at the goals of the war, collapse of Hamas and elimination of its military capability, the goal number one, we have only again achieved this, but not completely. Gaza no longer poses a threat to Israel. The people are able to go home, but as long as Hamas is there, again, this is not done. We were able to free the hostages. It was late, but it's not all of them. Not all of it was smooth. We were able to, unfortunately, hurt a number of them. A number of them were killed in the process. The displaced residents are able to come back, begin to come back, but they do it with some fears, and not all of them yet. And security, which is another task on the West Bank, is not yet achieved. And the last is what's next in Gaza. So the difference between the picture on the top, which is one of those AI that has to do with the Gaza Riviera of Trump, and the Gaza reality here, of course, the difference is startling. It's not that we have good ideas for Gaza, but I just want to conclude by throwing the four different directions in where the whole question of Gaza can go. So direction number one is Israeli occupation. The war may continue. At least the Prime Minister would like to continue the war. He speaks about this. This is connected to the phase 2 of the deal, or if it will happen or it will not happen. You know, the signal yesterday from President Trump may also be connected to it. It's not something that the army, let's say, would like to do, because it means that Israel needs to take responsibility on all of Gaza or parts of Gaza, occupy it, take responsibility, take over the schools, try to create de-radicalization process under occupation. And you probably will tell me, yes, okay, we understand it. Of course, it was tried before. It didn't really succeed before. We're not sure if it will succeed now. It's not the best of options, but it's certainly an option that exists. Option number 2 is giving this to the Palestinian Authority, because we don't want Hamas there. Of course, Israel does not trust the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority was not able to deal with the issues in Jenin. It's very unlikely that it will be able to take over Gaza, and Israel does not really trust the Palestinians' leadership, who is weak and corrupt. But that's certainly an option, and something that is being pushed also by some of the other Arab partners. Option number 3 is what now seems to be emerging as the Arab option. You've heard that also from Israeli leaders, basically saying, look, the Arabs can take responsibility. We'll have a team, an Arab team, that will come to Gaza. They will have a mandate. They will be stakeholders. So let's say the Egyptian plan, or the Egyptian and the Saudis, and the Emiratis, and then you can put the Americans and the Europeans as a joint team. They're sending a team of experts. This team of experts creates and elects leadership that is local, bypassing this issue of Hamas or no Hamas, because they need to find people. It's basically technocrats, and they will be able to create a process of reconstruction and lead Gaza into better days. And eventually the aim is to do a process that will create Gaza to be better, more like Singapore and less like Afghanistan. And of course, a lot needs to happen: rebuilding, clearing all the trash, perhaps build artificial islands. There are different ideas that are being thrown in the air. The there is some chance for this, and really the Trump plan was a trigger to get the Arabs to finally do something on this. I just wanted to note also in my presentation that I told you that the Arabs are not very keen on fighting in Gaza, sending troops. They're maybe willing to put some money there. It's easier than actually taking responsibility. They also don't trust the Palestinians, and we have a real danger that we're going to have a process of another 10 years, going to be another temporary solution. But what we have done, we haven't really sorted the Palestinian problem. We haven't, perhaps we sorted Gaza, but only to a limited effect, and we're not sure if we're going to have another round of war in 10 more years. And then comes the Trump plan. Now, the Trump plan is interesting in two respects. The most interesting piece of it is that it's basically, well, that's, I guess, Trump, and you know your president more than I, but it throws all the cards and is forces to think outside of the box. So it's not necessarily Gaza yes or Gaza no, or two-state solution or something else. He says, okay, let's just think in advance. He's also basing this, and I guess this is connected to who sold him that idea, but there's some merit in the assumption that Gaza is difficult, not just because of the context of that it's not easy to, there's so much damage and it's difficult to build when all the people are there, but also because there is a real chance that if we're not doing something dramatically different, radically different, we're going to find ourselves in another round of war in 10 years. And so that's not something that we may want to see. And therefore he said, okay, well, let's try to get the people out. The big problem with this is, again, where all of these plans so far are trying to find a solution to Gaza, not a solution to the Palestinian issue. We're not core issues yet. We're going to have refugees, if either they're going to be in Gaza or they're going to be somewhere else. And then in 10 years, we also need to find some solution for them. And therefore, all of these solutions are really a degree of temporary solution that do not really sort the core parts of the problem. It could be that somebody will say, look, let's try to do something a little different and begin to think of even a larger solution in where perhaps Gaza should not be returned to the Palestinians, but in the same token, perhaps we can have a Palestinian state created in the West Bank, some settlements removed from the West Bank, perhaps even to Gaza. Gaza can be developed and also as a free trade zone, part of it that's going to be accessible also to the Palestinians, but create a direction, thinking that will point to a path of a future resolution to all the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the question of the Palestinian refugees, since without that, it's going to be very difficult to see an end for these cycles of wars and conflict on the Palestinian front that we have seen the worst off on October 7th. So the future, my friends, and with this I'll end. The future, this is of course, Middle East can look different. If we're looking at the prospects for the future, there is a chance that from all of this carnage and destruction, we will be able to emerge to a different and new beginning. Maybe to normalization with Saudi Arabia, maybe to resetting relationship with Syria, perhaps even with Lebanon. And if the leadership will be able to really give a serious push to rethinking our relationship with the Palestinians. There are two forces in the Middle East that drive all the dynamics I've suggested to you and I've described to you. There are the forces of the radicals, the Islamists, the forces of resistance, the axis of resistance, and then there's the axis of renaissance, which includes not only Israel, but a number of other countries that are more pragmatic and understand that in order to survive, in order to bring prosperity, they have to find a path that takes them in the directions of the Abraham Accords. After a long war that is not ended yet, but in where we were able to really distance and weaken the axis of resistance by really enabling what had happened in Syria, by weakening Hezbollah and decapitating its leadership, by showing a significant resolve and success in all these fronts, we actually have a chance to empower the axis of moderation. It will require, of course, some effort and some willingness from the Israeli leadership, and I hope that we will be able to get there, but the chance exists. And this is why I told you from the beginning that I want to end with a bit of an optimistic note and a note of hope, and I cannot do it differently. I'm Israeli after all. My national anthem is called Tikva, is called hope. Thank you very much for this. I hope it was useful, and happy to engage in any questions that any of you might have.
Okay. Let's see. So Barbara Weinberg, I see your hand raised.
Yes, I have. Hi, thank you so much. That was wonderful. I have two questions. One is why do the Arabs not trust the Palestinians? And the other question is related to the most recent Trump tweet from Truth Social, saying that there'd be hell to pay if the hostages are not released, and that that they would basically, people would all be dead if they don't listen to what he says. Thank you.
So the Arabs who do not trust the Palestinians, I think, rely on a similar analysis to the analysis that I just suggested to you. They look at history and they look at what the Palestinian leadership had done. They believe that the Middle East is not about winning and losing over the question of Israel. They believe that prosperity will come by collaboration, by sharing of resources. And they believe in an interpretation of also Islamic texts that accepts this. And they believe that Israel is here to stay. It's a fact. It's a strong enough country. We're not going to just win over this. And that the idea of peace or normalization and cooperation is good because eventually it's about the people. It's about the future of their children. And they see what the Palestinians have done. Now, again, I don't need to remind you the entire history, but just enough to speak about 2005. I spoke here with people who were involved in collecting money, and there was a lot of money that was collected in 2005 that was meant to give the Israeli settlements in Gaza, so they will leave all the equipment and all the farming houses to the Palestinians, just so they will be able to use it and create prosperity. The Palestinians have taken all of this, including millions of dollars of Jewish philanthropy, and converted it into Qassam missiles and continuing to fight Israel rather than taking care of their own children. And eventually, after they destroyed everything, they calling the people from UAE and Abu Dhabi to pay the price and now build Gaza again. Of course, they're going to be angry at them because they're causing problems. They want other people to pay for them, and they're causing tensions. This is partly why the Abraham Accords were created. I think what we've seen yesterday with the tweet was, of course, well, I guess a part of an emotional response. But what we've also seen is Trump saying, from my perspective, I have given Netanyahu the green light to continue the war in Gaza. This is really what it means politically. I've given the Netanyahu the weapons he asked for, and I've given the green light, and I'm calling you guys to come back to the table. I heard here from people who interesting conversations in Florida with people who are engaged with the president, that he's always over negotiating, and he's whatever he says, what he says in a certain way. But I think that's really what it means. Perhaps it meant to put some more pressure on a potential agreement, or to say to what Netanyahu wants is to continue the fight until Hamas is going to be further decapitated.
Thank you. Jack and Joan Halpern, and then I have a question in the chat.
Thank you for speaking with us. My concern as an ex-military guy, not of your stature, of course, is when I look at the strength of the countries around and I look at the issues facing Israel, my concern is the vast buildup of the Egyptian military in the Sinai over an expansive build out of bridges over the canal. That seems to me that, where's that issue going?
So thank you for that, and of course you are correct. And if you've noticed, this issue became a bit more visible. There are 22,000 soldiers that are supposed to be in the Sinai. There are many more, and the Egyptians have been advancing forces. They're also investing significant energy in military. This perhaps a part of the projections of force. They don't have enemies per se, and they're still using Israel as the not really as the enemy, but as the power to which they compare their military. We have been taking this issue forward, and this has been a dilemma, because on the one hand, we would like the Egyptians to clear the Sinai from influences that are both not positive for Egypt, but even worse for us. Egypt was supposed to be responsible for the work for all the tunnels and in the Gaza border. When Philadelphia was in Egyptian control, Hamas was able to create all these smuggling routes. At some point, after some pressure, Egypt blocked some of them, but there's so much corruption and relatively little control of the Egyptians that it became an ongoing dilemma. This dilemma is real, but it's not, we do not consider it as real in the context of Egyptian-Israeli war. We don't see that progressing toward that level. But it's important to reach, to lower these tensions, and also the dilemma of the Philadelphia corridor. If Israel is going to abandon the corridor and is not going to be a mechanism, we can see again, because of the level of corruptions with the Council of Arab Tribes, and I'm not going to get into details of this because it includes lots of names. There are actually a mechanism, corrupt mechanism, that goes all the way to Sisi's family. The Egyptians were able to smuggle people out basically based on bribes. And some people had made a lot of money just on all of that. All of these practices are not serving us. They're not serving the future of Gaza, and they're being dealt with in different ways. The U.S. is very important here because the U.S. guarantees the peace accord between the two countries and actually provides significant military aid to Egypt. And because of that, that's also another guarantee that Egypt is not going to go too far. But you're right, it's a concern. And it's a concern that was highlighted in a significant way, also even just last week with Ambassador Leiter putting this on the top of the agenda. And I believe that Egypt will withdraw some of the forces and they'll find a solution for this. And hopefully, at some point, we'll be able to bring also countries like Egypt to the idea that progress of the country is not just about how many tanks and how many airplanes it has. But for that, we need a warmer peace, a more stable peace. Egypt is not there. The last students that attempted to apply to my university, Tel Aviv University, 3 years ago, from Egypt, for 42 years, we've never had a student from Egypt. The Egyptians blocked her, confiscated her passport, and put her on a house arrest. That's their approach for normalization and peace.
You know, just a side note, in 1981, I was teaching a course for the International Atomic Energy Agency. I had, it was a 3-month course. I had people in there from Egypt who were proposing to build a nuclear plant, and we had people in there from the Israel Atomic Energy Agency. And in 1982, no matter what it said in the press, they got along great.
Yeah, it was a better time. In 1982, there were also more Israelis in Egypt, and we had like direct bus lines, and yeah, but it's a cold peace. We have security cooperation, but it's a cold peace, a lot of corruption there, and it's a challenge, but I don't anticipate an Egyptian-Israeli war, if that was where your question was leading.
Thank you. I'm very pleased and very happy to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you. The question in the chat, Rabbi Amy Gross-Paplesa, how do we begin to change the educational system of the Palestinians to move them from hate towards acceptance and collaboration and to work toward peace? Is there any chance of doing this with the various Islamist groups?
So, Amy, thank you for that. That's a good and an important question. I'll give a plug for an interesting group that I also happen to be involved with, and I sit on its board. It's called the Institute Impact SE, the Institute of Monitoring Peace and Cultural Tolerance in School Education. And this is a research group that did a lot of work on education in the Middle East, exploring the textbooks in the context of acceptance of the others, in the context of issues that has to do with minorities and women and rights, and the overall tone of the books according to criteria that were made by UNESCO. The Palestinian books are indeed very negative. The remaining countries in the Abraham Accords, and interestingly enough, even Egypt have actually changed their books in the last few years in a much more positive fashion. The group that I mentioned, Impact SE, even built curriculum that is a Palestinian curriculum that is divorced of incitement. Some of the schools in the schools in East Jerusalem have already began to use, because it's under Israeli influence, to use the new curriculum, and we were trying to prepare this curriculum also to use it in Gaza. But remember that the curriculum is only half of the problem. We also need the teachers to be willing to teach a different curriculum. And of course, we need the government that will be willing to develop a curriculum of peace. This is why the example of the countries of the Abraham Accords is so important. Of course, the Islamist groups who are willing to die for the cause are not going to be the ones who will educate. What you need here is a process that is deep of de-radicalization. And for that, you really need to find partners. And perhaps in that sense, and I'm saying this very sadly, and I'm not sure that President Trump has all the insights and all the nuances on what's happening in Gaza. But the point about the fact that in Gaza in particular, and I speak with Gazans who are friends and colleagues and who are fighting against this, they're very much in the vast minority, not the vast majority. There is a very good chance that if Gaza will remain in the same configuration in some way, in 10 years down the road, we'll see the same problem because of these same issues. And therefore, the idea of doing something radically different, which may even include having not the, moving some people somewhere else, or creating like a very strict mandate controlled by somebody else that the process of de-radicalization can happen, is important. We know in recent history that a process as such taken place in Germany, a process as such had taken place in Japan. We have historical examples that this can happen, and it's a key, and it's also not just a key; it's also a measure. Because if we see that this is what still exists, even in the Palestinian Authority, who has agreements with Israel, then we understand that it's very difficult, and we may not want to put them in charge for Gaza again for a agenda of incitement. So not a lot of optimism here. It's an important question, and it's an important vehicle for this. And hopefully, as we attempt to think of day after and rebuilding, this is one of the core questions that needs to be addressed.
Thank you so much. I'm not seeing additional hands. If people would like to connect with Dr. Boms afterwards, be in touch. Oh, Henry, you'll be the last question. Always a pleasure, Henry.
Oh my gosh. Thank you, Dr. Boms. Two-part question, please. Since October 7th, how many voices in Israel do we hear about Israel should never have left Gaza in 2005? And the second part of the question is, are there voices now in Israel that have resurrected Maya Kahana's viewpoints?
Well, thank you, Henry. And again, two important questions. Of course, 2005, the time of disengagement comes again to the fall. I just saw today that the son, Omri Sharon, the son of the late Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, was commenting on this, that disengagement was the right thing to do, but then Ulmert screwed it up. I think in the historical hindsight, it's difficult to justify disengagement. The logic of disengagement, and I had a chance to even hear Sharon at the time and speak with his team in some meetings that I had a chance still to attend, was that we will be able to stabilize the borders of Israel. We did not really want Gaza. It probably was a mistake not to insist that Egypt will keep it in 1979. That was the first mistake. And the second mistake was just to leave and leave it like that. But at some point, the broader picture is that we would not necessarily wish to be there, because that's also not going to be a solution. But there are many voices that will now say, look at what we've done. But it's not just this. I mean, remember that the Shalit deal, the Shalit deal, in 2013 was the one that brought over 1,100 terrorists. One of them was Yahya Sinwar back to Gaza. So the Israeli policies have been very instrumental in developing some of the dynamics, and of course there was a degree of introspection all across. Of course, it's also connected to the overall political direction and the story I mentioned with people like Vivian Silver, who believed in peace and paid the most difficult price for it, or another one, which I'm not sure if is familiar, Ophir Lipstein, the head of the Sha'ar HaNegev Council, who was one of the people who, again, was killed in Kfar Aza. The thing that he was working on is on a industrial zone, joint industrial zone, where people could enter from Gaza and from Israel, really a zone of economic progress and prosperity. He was literally working on this as the Hamas killed him, as he was working for a better future in Gaza. Of course, all of this brings people back to more radical views, similar to Meir Kahana. And here, I would even say that this issue is becoming even more convoluted. President Trump, in I think the first week is in his office, following his pardon for the January 6th crowd, had also canceled some sanctions over some settlers group. The Minister of Defense, Israeli Minister of Defense, followed suit and did the same thing right after him. And 3 days later, 2 Palestinian villages were burned by sort of what you describe a little bit of the Meir Kahana crowd. So radicalization and polarization is broadly, I think I perceive it as negative, not as a positive, because that's not always the way to sort problems. But one can understand why I would say anger and people who think that there is no other solution but simply asking the Arabs to leave, sending them out, or even doing it violently is the only way. It's a problem. It's a problem in Israel. I think there are plenty of people who would tell it's a problem in this country too. I think solutions should not come from the radical elements; they should come from the middle. But these dynamics certainly exist, and I hope that we will be able to curb the extremists on all sides. Although I think, as a historian, as somebody who observes through it, it's not about comparing them. There is one side that is far more extreme than the other. As much as I don't like some Kahana and extremists who come from our side, the other side is much worse.
Thank you for coming together for this learning dedicated to Rabbi Akiva Mann. His family, his sons Eli, Ari, Simyo, and daughter-in-law Dana have been part of the conversation, and I know that their pain and their loss rings deeply, stirringly in their hearts. And I wish for them consolation, and also to begin learning to, the practice that we've all had of hearing his voice in the world of machshava. I see Ellie just turned on your video. Do you have it? And Sim, thank you. Anything. So we will continue to dedicate learning all year long, but especially as a recognition of the Yarzeit. If anyone would like to be in touch with Dr. Boms, if you send one of us in your IJKL a request, I'll connect you both WhatsApp and on email. He's been so generous. And for those of us who've had chances to really spend time with him, we all have an invitation for Shabbat at his Interesting Persons Shabbat table. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, everyone. God bless. Thank you.